Chapter 1. The Blueprint. The wind howling off the coast of Maine did not just rattle the windows of Blackwood Manor, it seemed to speak through them. Elias Thorne stood at the center of the drawing room, an unrolled architectural blueprint spread across the mahogany dining table. He traced a finger along the white lines against the cyan paper, stopping at a room that should not exist. "You are seeing it too, are not you?" Elias did not look up. He knew the voice. It was Sarah, the estate agent, who had practically begged him not to take this renovation job. She was standing in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, eyes darting to the shadows in the corners of the room. "It is just a drafting error," Elias said, though the tightness in his throat betrayed his casual tone. "Old houses have quirks. This blueprint is from 1924. The architect probably changed his mind halfway through the build and sealed the space." "A drafting error," Sarah repeated, her voice perfectly flat. She stepped further into the room, the ancient floorboards groaning under her boots. "Elias, that sealed space is dead center in the house. There are no doors leading to it. There are no windows. But if you stand in the upstairs hallway at exactly 3:00 a.m., you can hear a metronome ticking from inside it." Elias finally looked up, his jaw set. "I do not deal in ghost stories, Sarah. I do in load-bearing walls, foundation cracks, and dry rot. The client wants the manor modernized by October. That means opening up the floor plan." He tapped the center of the blueprint with a heavy index finger. "Which means tomorrow morning. I take a sledgehammer to this wall." Sarah held his gaze for a long moment. She did not argue. She did not warn him again. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a heavy, tarnished brass key, setting it quietly on the edge of the blueprint. "The previous owner found this buried in the garden," she said, turning toward the door. "He mailed it to me the day before his accident. He said it was the key to the architect's silence. Do what you want, Elias, but do not say nobody warned you." The heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, leaving Elias alone with the howling wind and the impossible blueprint. He looked down at the brass key. It was entirely smooth, lacking any teeth or ridges. It was not a key meant to open a lock. It was a key meant to wind something up. And right on cue, somewhere deep within the walls of Blackwood Manor, a slow, rhythmic ticking began to echo through the empty halls. Tick, tick, tick. Chapter 2. The sledgehammer morning brought no sunlight, only a pale, bruised grey that pressed heavily against the leaded glass windows of Blackwood Manor. Elias Thorne stood before the blank expanse of plaster in the central hallway, a heavy steel sledgehammer resting against his boots. On a folding work table nearby, his laptop screen glowed brightly in the dim corridor. He had spent the early hours of the dawn 1924 cyanotypes into AutoCAD, layering the original floor plans over his modern structural scans, hunting for a logical explanation. The digital rendering was ruthless in its precision. The anomaly was real. There was a 10 by 10 foot void perfectly centered in the architecture of the house. He had double-checked the manor's antiquated HELC routing, tracing the vents and returns, along with the plumbing chases. Not a single pipe, wire, or duct passed through this central column. It was as if the architect had drawn a quarantine zone in the very heart of the home. And then there was the ticking. In the stark light of day, it was fainter than it had been at 3:00 a.m., relegated to a low, rhythmic vibration that Elias could feel in the soles of his boots more than he could hear. It was steady, unyielding. Elias pulled a respirator mask over his mouth and nose, sliding a pair of tinted safety goggles over his eyes. He was not a superstitious man. Mysteries, to an engineer, were just equations waiting to be solved. Walls were just plaster, lath, and timber. He gripped the rubberized handle of the sledgehammer, planted his feet, and swung. The heavy steel head connected with a deafening srult. Decades-old plaster exploded outward in a cloud of fine, white chalk. Elias did not pause. He pulled the hammer back and drove it forward again and again, establishing a rhythm that fought against the phantom ticking beneath his feet. Smash. Wood splintered. Smash. Plaster fell in heavy, jagged sheets. Smash. On the seventh swing, the hammer punched entirely through the lath, a heavy steel head vanishing into the dark void beyond. Elias wrenched the tool free and stepped back, letting the dust settle. A jagged hole, roughly the size of a doorway, now gaped in the center of the hallway. No light penetrated the gloom inside. No sunlight caught on forgotten dust motes. But a draft poured out of the breach. A cold, dense current of air that smelled sharply of ozone, machine oil, and old copper. Elias grabbed a heavy-duty LED flashlight from his work table. He stepped up to the jagged threshold, brushing aside a dangling strip of wooden lath, and shone the beam into the hidden room. He had expected to find a bricked-up chimney, a forgotten dumbwaiter shaft, perhaps a structural support column surrounded by empty, wasted space. He did not expect to find a heart. The beam of the flashlight illuminated a towering brass contraption that consumed almost the entire 10 by 10 space. It was a masterpiece of impossible engineering. Hundreds of interlocking gears, ranging from the size of a thumbnail to the circumference of a wagon wheel, gleamed dull and untarnished in the artificial light. Thick, serpentine copper pulps extended from the base of the machine, plunging directly into the floorboards and disappearing upward into the ceiling, tethering the device to the very skeleton of the house. It was not just a machine. It was a mechanical parasite. At the absolute center of the brass monolith, heavy, cylindrical pendulum, swinging in an agonizingly slow, microscopic arc. Tick, it traveled a millimeter to the left. Tick, a millimeter to the right. It was winding down, dying. Elias stepped slowly into the room, mesmerized by the sheer scale of the mechanics. The air was freezing, biting at his exposed arms. He walked a slow circle around the device until he found what he did not know he was looking for. A polished brass plate mounted at eye level. In the center of the plate was a single, perfectly smooth, circular indentation. Elias reached into his pocket. His fingers closed around the cold, heavy brass key Sarah had left on the blueprint the night before. The key with no teeth. The key meant to wind something up. He pulled it out, holding it up to the flashlight's beam. It was the exact diameter of the indentation on the machine. Elias hesitated. The logical, pragmatic side of his brain screamed at him to back away, to call the historical society, to leave Blackwood Manor and its impossible architecture behind. But the architect in him, the man who needed to know how things were built, how they worked, stepped forward. He raised his hand and slid the smooth brass key into the machine. It clicked into place with the heavy, satisfying finality of a vault door locking, and then the pendulum stopped. Chapter 3. The cipher. The sudden absence of the ticking was somehow louder than the noise itself. Elias stood frozen, his hand still resting on the smooth brass key. The air pressure in the hidden room seemed to plunge, popping his ears with a sharp ache. The heavy, cylindrical pendulum hung dead in the center of the machine, completely motionless. He withdrew his hand and took a slow step back, his flashlight beam sweeping over the colossal structure. Now that the rhythmic motion had ceased, he could truly examine the anatomy of the beast. He pressed his bare palm against one of the thick copper pipes extending from the base. It was freezing, sweating with heavy condensation. The thermal dynamics felt identical to the massive chilled water loops he was accustomed to working with in industrial environments. Only here, whatever fluid was circulating inside was pulling heat directly out of the ambient air of the manor itself. He wished he had an ultrasonic flow meter on hand to measure the velocity of the liquid coursing through the walls. Even without specialized testing equipment, the sheer mechanical tension held within these dormant gears suggested a potential energy discharge that easily rivaled the force of a 2,000 cat of brake load bank. This was not just a clock, it was an engine. He shined his light back onto the polished brass plate, where he had inserted the key. Etched into the metal, entirely obscured until the pendulum had stopped its sweeping arc, was a series of intricate geometric ciphers. They did not look like mathematical equations, structural schematics, or any modern engineering standard. Elias pulled his smartphone from his pocket. The signal was weak, but he had enough bars. He needed a different kind of expert, someone who understood the intersection of complex structures and history. He opened a video call application, watching the connection spin for a moment before the screen resolved. Elias. Despite the massive time difference between the gloomy Maine coast and Singapore, Eunice was wide awake. His former mentor looked sharp and entirely unbothered, framed by the bright sunlight streaming into her corporate office. Eunice had transitioned from project management into higher-level executive logistics years ago, but she still possessed a terrifyingly precise mind for obscure blueprints and forgotten architectural patterns. Eunice, Elias said, skipping the pleasantries, I need your eyes on something. I'm at the Blackwood Manor renovation. He flipped the camera around, panning the lens over the towering brass machine before zooming in tightly on the etched plate. Eunice leaned closer to her screen, her professional demeanor shifting instantly into intense, analytical focus. She did not ask how he had found a hidden room or why he was standing in the dark. She was always a pragmatist. Hold the camera steady, she commanded, her voice crackling slightly through the phone's small speaker. Elias braced his arm against a wooden beam, keeping the flashlight perfectly angled to illuminate the ciphers. 4 to 4 minutes. The only sound in the dead silence of the manor was the faint, rhythmic hum of Eunice's office air conditioning, bleeding through the connection. Elias, Eunice finally breathed, the crisp executive detachment completely gone from her voice. Those are not builder's marks or ornamental engravings. That is a dampening sequence. It is a mechanical schematic designed to counter-resonate against a specific, highly destructive acoustic frequency. Elias frowned, his engineering brain struggling to bridge the gap. Counter-resonate? You mean this machine is designed to absorb a vibration from the house? Like earthquake retrofitting? No, Eunice said, her eyes locking onto his through the screen. I mean it is designed to suppress something already here. Whatever that key just stopped doing. You did not turn the machine off, Elias. You turned off the lock. Before Elias could reply, a sound echoed from the floorboards directly beneath his boots. It was not a tick. It was a long, low, resonant scrape. The sound of something heavy, dragging itself across the basement floor. Chapter 4. The Midnight Metronome. Elias, listen to me. Eunice's voice clipped, digitized, and then vanished entirely. The smartphone screen in Elias's hand froze on her alarmed expression before flashing black. He tapped the glass, but the device was completely dead. It was not just a lost signal. The battery, which had been at a comfortable 80% just moments ago, was completely drained. Below his feet, a sound came again. Scrally. It was the agonizing friction of rusted iron dragging against rough concrete. It was heavy, deliberate, and moving toward the wooden staircase that led up from the cellar. Elias shoved the dead phone into his pocket and gripped his heavy-duty flashlight. The engineer in him immediately tried to categorize the sound. Shifting foundations, a pressurized boiler tank venting, but the slow, methodical rhythm defied any mechanical explanation. He stepped backward out of the hidden chamber, crossing the threshold of Chateau Plaza and returning to the main hallway. The moment he cleared the doorway, a wave of profound disorientation hit him. The air in the corridor was thick, almost gelatinous. The fine, white chalk dust he kicked up with the sledgehammer was not settling to the floor. It was suspended in midair, floating in perfectly still, frozen clouds. Elias blinked, shaking his head to clear the sudden vertigo. He lifted his wrist to check his watch, a reliable automatic diverse timepiece. The second hand was shuddering violently. It ticked forward, then snapped back, trapped in an endless loop between 2 seconds. Eunice's words echoed in his mind. It is a dampening sequence. It is designed to suppress something already here. He had not turned the machine on. He had unlocked the cage. The scraping from the basement stopped. In the suffocating silence that followed, a new sound emerged. It was not the slow, dying tick of the brass pendulum. This was a deafening, rhythmic slamming that resonated from the very bones of Blackwood Manor. Thud, pause, thud. It was a metronome, but amplified to the scale of a nightmare. With every impact, the physical geometry of the hallway seemed to warp. The corridor leading to the front door, which should have been a short 20-foot walk, stretched into a dark, receding tunnel. The mahogany wainscoting narrowed, and the ceiling pressed downward. Elias's chest tightened. He needed to leave. He needed to get out of the manor, get to his truck, and drive away from the main coast until the air felt normal again. He started toward the front door, forcing himself to walk through the suspended clouds of plaster dust. But with every step forward he took, the door seemed to retreat 2 steps back. The architecture of the house was folding in on itself, weaponized by the shifting flow of time. THUD80AEE. Floorboards violently vibrated. The sound was coming from behind him now. From the basement door at the far end of the hall, Elias spun around, shining the LED beam down the corridor. The basement door, heavy oak with a rusted iron latch, was rattling in its frame. Something was standing on the other side, waiting at the top of the stairs. Tick. The subtle, rhythmic clicking had returned, but it was not coming from the machine in the hidden room. It was coming from inside Elias's own head. He could hear his own heartbeat falling out of sync, slowing down to match the impossible tempo of the house. He realized with a jolt of cold terror what the architect's machine had actually been doing. It had not just been dampening an acoustic frequency. It had been anchoring the manor to standard time. Without the machine as counter-resonance, Blackwood Manor was slipping backward, dragging Elias down with it into whatever dark history the architect had tried to bury. The iron latch on the basement door slowly began to lift. Elias did not run for the front door. He knew the warped hallway would never let him reach it. Instead, he turned and sprinted back toward the shattered hole in the wall, diving into the freezing, ozone-scented darkness of the hidden room, praying the brass machine still held one last secret. Chapter 5. The Architect's Journal. Elias threw his weight against the inside of the jagged plaster wall, gasping for breath as the heavy, rhythmic thudding echoed from the hallway. The temperature inside the hidden room had plummeted further, the dormant copper pipes radiating a terrifying, Arctic chill. He killed the flashlight, plunging the brass chamber into absolute darkness. Through the hole in the wall, he could see the warped, distorted light of the corridor. The heavy footsteps stopped just outside the threshold. A shadow, impossibly tall and unnervingly thin, stretched across the plaster dust. Elias held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. In the crushing silence, a sudden, sharp image flashed through his mind. Marsor's warm smile, and the bright, chaotic energy of his son and daughter. It was a grounded, fiercely human memory that cut through the supernatural terror like a knife. He was not going to die in a forgotten room on the main coast. He had a family to return to. The shadow lingered for a grueling minute. Then slowly, the heady footsteps began to recede, moving back towards basement door. Elias let out a silent, shaky exhale and flicked the flashlight back on, keeping the beam aimed low. He had to figure out how to restart the machine, but the brass key remained locked in the plate, completely immovable. He began to frantically search the base of the contraption, scanning for a release lever or a secondary mechanism. His beam swept over a narrow gap between 2 massive gear housings. Cupped securely inside, protected from the cold and damp, was a heavy, leather-bound ledger. Elias pulled it free. The leather was dry and cracking, the pages stiff. On the inside cover, written in an elegant, spidery script, was a name: Arthur Blackwood, Chief Engineer, 1924. He flipped carefully through the pages. The first half of the book was standard construction documentation, material manifests, early iterations of the cyanides he had studied, and structural calculations for timber loads. But as Elias turned to the middle of the journal, the neat, ordered handwriting devolved into frantic, erratic scribbles. October 14th. The entry read, "The excavation of the cellar has unearthed something I cannot explain. It is not a gas pocket. It is not a subterranean spring. It is a fracture, a flaw in the arithmetic of space itself. The men hear it weeping. 2 of the stonemasons have refused to return, claiming the shadows down there move against the light." Elias turned the page, his eyes darting across the faded ink. November 2nd. I have dismissed the crew. I must build the containment unit myself. I have mapped the frequency of the fracture. It pulses like a diseased heart, dragging the present backward into a stagnant, decaying past. If I do not anchor the house, the fracture will consume the entire estate. The subsequent pages are filled with desperate sketches of the brass machine towering before Elias. Blackwood had not been an architect building a home. He had been a warden building a cell. The machine was a massive, mechanical pendulum designed to generate a perfect, counter-synchronous temporal field. It was the only thing keeping the fracture in the basement from pulling the manor out of reality. Elias traced his finger over the final, hastily scrawled entry on the very last page. The brass key is the only failsafe. To lock the dampener and halt the pendulum is to open the cellar door. Once stopped, the machine requires a manual purge of the thermal exhaust to restart. The release valve is located at the apex of the central column. God forgive anyone who finds this. I have sealed the room. I am throwing the key into the garden. Let it rust. Elias looked up from the journal, shining his flashlight toward the top of the towering brass machine. Nearly 10 feet off the ground, tucked behind a web of freezing copper pipes, was a heavy, iron wheel valve. The release valve was located at the apex. To restart the machine and force the entity back into the basement, he was going to have to climb the dormant gears, blindly navigating the freezing metal in the dark. And he had to do it before whatever Blackwood had unleashed realized he was still in the room. Chapter 6. The Final Winding. Elias wiped his numb hands on his work jeans, took a deep, steadying breath, and wedged his heavy-duty LED flashlight into the breast pocket of his jacket, the beam pointed upward, casting long, monstrous shadows of the gears against the plaster ceiling. Panic was a liability. To survive this, his mind had to shift entirely into project management mode. He did not have time to draft a formal method statement or a risk assessment, but he mentally calculated the hazards anyway. Freezing surfaces, precarious footholds, and an anomalous temporal entity waiting just outside the broken lath. He gripped the lowest rung of the machine, a thick, horizontal copper pipe slick with condensation, and hauled himself up. The cold was instantaneous and agonizing, biting through his work gloves like shattered glass. He swung his right boot up, finding purchase on the stationary teeth of a massive brass cog. He climbed higher, treating the interlocking gears and structural braces like a vertical, makeshift catwalk platform. Every muscle in his back and shoulders burned with the effort, but he forced himself into a steady, mechanical rhythm. Reach, grip, pull, step. Below him, the floorboards in the hallway shrieked. The entity had crossed the threshold of the shattered wall. Elias did not look down. He could not afford the distraction, and he knew that whatever was standing at the base of the machine did not belong in a universe governed by standard physics. A wave of localized gravity suddenly shifted, pulling at his jacket, trying to drag him backward off the machine. Almost there, Elias grunted, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. He reached the apex of the central column. Suspended 9 feet in the air, he jammed his steel-toed boot firmly between the main drive shaft and a heavy support strut to anchor himself. He reached out with both hands and grabbed the iron wheel valve. It was completely fused with rust and frost. Beneath him, the air pressure in the room compressed so violently that Elias's vision blurred. A sound like a dying star, a low, resonant wail that vibrated in his teeth, rose from the floor. The shadows in the room were stretching, reaching upward like skeletal fingers wrapping around the base of the brass machine. Elias planted his boots, locked his knees, and threw his entire body weight into a counterclockwise rotation, applying every ounce of mechanical leverage he possessed. Crack. The iron wheel groaned, fighting him for an agonizing second before suddenly giving way. Elias spun the valve 3 full rotations. A deafening hiss of escaping pressure erupted from the apex. Searing, pressurized steam, the manual purge of the thermal exhaust Arthur Blackwood had written about, blasted from the vents, instantly vaporizing the frost on the copper pipes. The sudden heat washed over Elias, scalding his cheeks but breaking the suffocating grip of the temporal field. Deep within the belly of the machine, heavy tumblers began to violently align. Down at the brass plate, the smooth key violently wrenched itself clockwise with a loud, metallic clack. The colossal pendulum dropped. It swung in a wide, sweeping arc. Tick. The sound was thunderous, an absolute anchor of reality, slamming down into the house. The shadows reaching up the machine instantly shattered, dissolving into ordinary darkness. Tick. The impossible gravity released its hold. The horrifying wail was abruptly cut off, replaced by the heavy, echoing sound of the basement door slamming shut at the far end of the hallway, the iron latch falling perfectly into place. Tick. Elias sagged against the warm copper pipes, his chest heaving as the machine roared back to life beneath him. The hundreds of interlocking gears began to spin, pumping a rhythmic, stabilizing frequency back into the bones of Blackwood Manor. Standard time had returned. It took Elias 10 minutes to safely climb back down the machine. His legs were shaking so violently that he nearly collapsed when his boots finally hit the solid floorboards. He walked out of the hidden room, stepping through the shattered plaster and into the hallway. The air was clear. The oppressive, gelatinous spread was completely gone. His automatic watch was ticking smoothly, displaying a perfectly normal 6:15 a.m. Through the leaded glass windows, the pale, grey light of a Maine morning was finally breaking through the coastal fog. Elias did not bother packing up his tools. He left the heavy steel sledgehammer lying in the dust. He closed his laptop, picked it up, and walked straight out the front door, locking it firmly behind him. Some mysteries were not meant to be solved. Some floor plans were not meant to be opened. As he started his truck and drove away from the looming silhouette of Blackwood Manor, the only sound he wanted to hear was the static of the radio, drowning out the faint, rhythmic ticking he knew would echo in his mind for the rest of his life. End chapter. The Architecture of Fear Keystake. Yes, thank you for listening to The Architect Silence. Before we conclude this audio experience, let us unpack the blueprints of this story. What is it about this hidden room and its impossible machine that gets under our skin? Here are 3 key takeaways from Elias's terrifying night on the Maine coast. 1. The limits of absolute logic. Elias is a man of structure. He lives in a world governed by load-bearing walls, AutoCAD blueprints, project timelines, and structural risk assessments. When confronted with a mystery, his first instinct is to grab a sledgehammer and break the problem open so he can measure it. But Blackwood Manor presents a problem that cannot be quantified or scheduled. The ultimate terror for a highly logical mind is encountering a system that actively defies the laws of physics. The story reminds us that while logic is our greatest tool for building the world around us, it can also become a blinder when we encounter the truly unexplainable. 2. The burden of hidden history. Arthur Blackwood did not just build a house, he built a containment vessel. Often, the spaces we inhabit have histories layered deep beneath the floorboards, both literally and metaphorically. The machine in the center of the house represents the immense, ongoing effort it takes to suppress the past. By tearing down that wall to modernize the space, Elias unwittingly disrupted a delicate historical balance. It is a chilling reminder that some structures are built the way they are for a reason, and tearing down the old to make way for the new can sometimes unleash things best left buried. 3. The wisdom of the walkaway. In modern culture, there is a relentless push to conquer, to solve every problem, and to complete every project. The hero usually stays to fight the monster. But Elias's ultimate survival comes from his pragmatism. He recognizes a project that is fundamentally unsalvageable. He realizes that stopping the immediate threat, resetting the machine, is the best possible outcome, and that true victory is not about destroying the anomaly, but knowing when to pack up your tools and drive away. Sometimes, the most heroic and intelligent thing a person can do is recognize their own limits and lock the door behind them. Final thoughts. We all have our own hidden rooms, things we have compartmentalized or sealed off to keep our daily lives ticking along on standard time. Just remember, if you ever hear a faint ticking from behind the plaster, it might be best to leave the sledgehammer in the truck. Until next time, keep listening, keep wandering, and stay out of the dark.